Welcome to the Codcast. I'm Bruce Moll from CommonWealth Magazine, and I'm joined today by two women who may have different perspectives on how the Massachusetts legislature operates. One is Erica Eiterhoven, the representative-elect from Somerville and the head of a group called Act on Mass, which is pressing for greater transparency at the State House. My other guest is the woman whom Eiterhoven is replacing, Representative Denise Provost, who didn't stand for re-election this year and is retiring in January after 14 years in the legislature. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you so much for having us.
Erica, let's start with you. How would you describe yourself politically, and tell us why you decided to run for a seat in the state legislature?
So I would say politically, I am a proud democratic socialist. I believe in a government that every resident, every voter has a shared say in what our government and our common goods look like. And so in terms of what I want to, why I ran and what I want to accomplish, I believe in building a state house that works for all people, that engages all of the voters and residents of Massachusetts. And my belief, and we can dive into this more, is that, the state house has not been in line with where working people's lives are. And we saw this in the budget last week, and this week, where we are not seeing the critical funding we need for our public transportation, our education, public health, right? These housing, these are all things that we need, and our voters believe that our state house should be leading on, that we should be leading the nation on these issues, and we simply aren't. And so I ran because I want to fight for a state house that works for everyone, but also engages all the voters of Massachusetts in a really meaningful way that it currently doesn't right now.
So your organization, Act on Mass, has a pretty big, in big type on its website, the Massachusetts State House is broken.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think that comes to what I was just saying earlier about, not engaging the public, right? When I say broken, it kind of happens at all sorts of levels, starting with many times reps are voting on things and they don't know what they're voting on, right? The public has very little time to engage with the bill, right? In fact, oftentimes when CommonWealth Magazine and other sources of media get the chance to finally understand what's going on, the vote's already passed, right? So we're doing a retrospective, this is what happened, rather than this is what they're voting on, and here's how you can have your voice heard. And so that's what I mean by the state house is broken, in that, democracy isn't just about voters casting their vote. That is an incredibly important part of it. But democracy is about information being out to voters so that voters, representatives, and people voting and representing on their behalf, right, have the full information and agency to make decisions. And so when folks call their voters, when voters call their representatives and they have to tell them, I actually didn't fully understand what I was voting on. I didn't understand the nuances of the bill, and therefore I didn't have enough time. That's a real problem in terms of how our democracy functions in Massachusetts. And I'll just say one very quick thing too about just transparency, because Act on Mass is often seen as like the transparency organization. I think that is a very necessary condition for a functioning democracy, but it's not just about that. It really is about making the state government accessible to people. And I'll just say too, because Rep. Provo and I represent a very young district. I'm actually the median age of our district, which is in the low 30s. And so we wanted to make the state government accessible to young people, particularly voters who have been left out of state politics. And when you look at who representatives are conditioned, and I'll say, to serve, the voters they serve and the voters who tend to vote in Democratic primaries and state elections tend to be white, tend to be older, and tend to own homes or own their property. And our goal was to really expand that voter base and the engagement of that voter base. And so for us, a lot of the work we do is online. It's to make it accessible for young people. We're hoping to launch a website in the next month that makes it so if you look up any issue, whether that's healthcare, climate change, education, you can see what are the bills that are addressing those issues and where those bills are and who are the decision makers and how do you engage with them, call them, tweet them, email them, whatever it is that you can do to get your voice heard. And so that's a really big part of our function beyond transparency in our mission as Act en Masse.
Representative, let's turn to you for a minute. So you have a lot of experience in the halls of the State House. What's your perspective? Is Erica on target, or is she naive?
Well, I think Erica has studied how the State House works a lot more than I had before I became a member. I was in local government until then, and didn't know a great deal actually about how things were. I would follow the newspaper stories about from when Tom Finneran was Speaker of the House, and complaints about his management style. But by the time I was elected, it was Speaker DeMacy. But certainly the State House is an opaque place. And the experience of working remotely and engaging with constituents who are trying to follow the legislature has made that abundantly clear to me.
So when you say opaque, I have my own vision of what you mean by that, but it may not be the same as what you're saying. So for a regular voter, they just can't figure out how it works, or what?
Well, certainly there's insufficient basic understanding, which makes me really glad that the legislature, has mandated civics education. That helps on the most superficial level. But, if I just talking about the budget, the inquiries that I've had from constituents, yesterday I had a conversation with someone who had emailed me urging me to vote in favor of certain amendments. And I had to call him up and say, we finished voting last Thursday night. It's in the Senate now. The budget's in the Senate now. And he was complaining about that. And I was trying to think how I would find out that information if I didn't get it as an insider. I've also had quite a number of communications from constituents who were following certain amendments, and of course some of the important bills that were filed as amendments, like emergency paid sick leave. And they can go online and find the consolidated amendments, but they're very confused by that because the consolidated amendment, includes every amendment that's considered. And a lot of people look at that and say, those are the amendments that were added. And, I've heard complaints like, how do you find out whether something was included or not in the budget? And I say, well, I think you have to read through the whole amendment, which is what the members have to do to find out what's in the consolidated. That's an example. I try to, in my communications with constituents and in my newsletter, my electronic newsletter, to explain the House. But I remember when I'd only been there a couple years, at a New Year's Eve party being asked, what's an informal session? And, not every legislature operates the same. And many people find our State House just mystifying.
It is a bit mystifying. And Erica, let's turn back to you for a minute, because a lot of the proposals that your organization has put forward are pretty meager, really. Let's disclose how people vote in committee.
Oh, it's pretty hard to disagree with.
It's very hard. Make bills public 72 hours prior to a vote. But then I have to admit that when I'm watching the budget being debated, it's very frustrating because the representative was talking about consolidated amendments.
Mhm.
And right now that happens obviously off camera.
Yeah.
But in real life, they all go into a room and you sort of have your own little mini legislature inside this room. I'd like to get this passed. We don't think that's a good idea, back and forth. And so what you end up with increasingly is lawmakers who give long speeches talking about a bill that they then, or an amendment, I should say, that they then withdraw. But they just wanted to get their point of view across. And I must admit, as it gets later and later, I'm going, shut up. I want this to move along quicker. But what you seem to be saying is slow down. Let's let everybody have their say. It's a messy process as it is, but you want to slow it down and make it more simpler. But I guess there's a little tension about wanting to get something done.
Sure.
And following all the democratic principles of everyone can say whatever they want, and it goes on and on and on. Because I remember the days when it would literally go on for a week, and the final 2 days would be round the clock, 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Now they've streamlined it and made it efficient, but a lot of those principles that you talk about have vanished. What do you think?
Well, I think we should probably turn to Representative Provost's previous experience in municipal government, right? Because our municipal governments are held to a standard that our state legislature isn't, because we write our own rules, right? And so in municipal government, we are held to, or not we, but municipal governments are held to open meeting law, right? They are held to public records law, right? These are all things that they manage to, and democracy is messy. There's no question about that, right? But they manage to have an open debate that is for the public to view and understand, that the state legislature doesn't. So I think it's not so much about the timing, how much debate, but to your point, right? We know that debate happens, but it does not happen in the public eye. It happens behind closed doors. And so I think that's something too that you'll notice that's very different from the Senate versus the House. In the Senate, if you watch session, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of back and forth. I mean, sure, some things do happen behind closed doors and it's not perfect, but it's not like in the House where it is what is on display for the public to view is strictly performative politics, right? It is to say, look, I made a point and that's the best I can do. And instead, all that real debate that we get to see in municipal government, that happens largely behind closed doors. And so that's the piece that we want to see changed, because, and you'll hear it too, even in the state house, right? It's, and again, this is a system. It's not just about individuals, but when you see bills like, this is really important actually for our district, preventing wage theft, right? This is a very simple bill that AFL-CIO is pushing for. I think if you work a hard days of work, you should be paid for it. There should not be wage theft. And, that's something like 70+% co-sponsorship. I mean, we have a veto-proof majority co-sponsorship. So why hasn't that bill, as it's written, right, as the AFL-CIO drafted it, not a weakened version, that bill as it is, why is that going nowhere? Right? And that happens often, right? And we saw this, fortunately the Roe Act did pass, but the Roe Act also had, a very high co-sponsorship, and yet not going anywhere. And so I think that's that disconnect that I'm speaking of the public seeing some things or unable to see things, and that playing out in the state legislature that is so fundamentally different to how every other body of government works in our state.
Representative, you care to address that? Why do you think that's the case?
Why did the legislature make itself exempt from the public records law? And
well, partly that, but I guess I'm talking about the broader issue of, I think what Erica is talking about is that we make our own rules, we do our own thing, and we're going to do a lot of things out of the public eye. Why do you think that maybe it's this opaque process? How do you figure it out? And is it by design?
Well, I think that's a fair inference. I think if that wasn't intended, if the opacity were not intentional, that the process would be more open. Some other inquiries I've had this week are about bills in conference committee. Constituents want to know what's going on with climate change, what's going on with police reform, because the House and Senate each passed a quite different version of bill on those two topics, and they're in conference committee. So conference committee is a deliberation that goes on among 6 members, completely out of the sight and hearing of other members. We can send letters to the conferees, and presumably could potentially have individual conversations, but the process is very well sealed. And maybe that's necessary or at least to an extent, for successful negotiations. Just as in diplomacy, you have Chatham House rules, you have the security of knowing that you can have wide-ranging conversations that aren't reported. But I've wondered, especially in the last few sessions, when some bills have ended up not coming out of conference at all, after all that work, wondering if our current conference committee process is a good one. And in terms of the amendment consolidation in the budget, in my early years in the State House, when there were a lot of members who were my senior, some of them would wax nostalgic about Finner and speakership and say, oh, in those days, we took up every single budget amendment. They weren't at that time bundled together. And it was, as you describe it, long days and nights of taking up every amendment and voting on it. And there's certainly a trade-off, I think, between efficiency and certain democratic principles like full debate and transparency. And doing things remotely during COVID has shifted that balance even further toward the unknowable, shall we say.
Yeah. Erica, in the time we have left, you have ambitions about how you'd like to change this body.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I mentioned to you before we went on the phone that I've seen a lot of, I shouldn't say that, I have seen other newcomers to the legislature talk with firebrand language about it's going to change and I'm going to help lead the change. And they do, but they also realize, I think, and it's true in Congress as well, that newcomers, if you want to get anything done, you're not expected to be shouting from the ramparts all the time. And so you have to work within the system. Mm-hmm. How do you see that tension? Do you want to work within the system to change it? Some of the people that came in the last session were talking pretty strong, and they've sort of now are working within the system, it seems like. Mm-hmm. Are you going to do that, or how are you going to approach that change?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, when we say working in the system, what does that mean? For me, what that means as a representative is working with my colleagues to build on our shared interests of the change we want to see. I'm certainly not alone in the State House. Maybe my language and my firebrandness might be unique, but in terms of our shared interests with other legislators who want to see a State House that respects their voice, right? Respects their point of view, respects their ability to have agency in this process, right? There is quite a wide swath of legislators who feel that way. And so it's my job and duty to bring those people along and to bring us together around a shared strategy and a shared mission, right? That's to me is what working, quote, in the system means, is that, as a legislator, you work with your colleagues to get things done. I think in terms of, the change I want to see too, there is a part that I think is so critical that we've almost lost, or our muscle, I should say, our democratic muscle is atrophied over the decades, is the engagement of voters, right? Because ultimately, I'll just say, and I think we spoke about this earlier, the State House is largely run like a corporation in that it's very hierarchical. And the power is held by a small number of people, and the rank and file reps and many, even I would say reps in some form of positional leadership feel that their voice doesn't get heard or isn't acknowledged. And the point is that we don't, this is not a corporation, right? Because we actually work for our constituents. That's our boss. And that's what something is so unique about democratic institutions, is that it isn't just about a CEO at the top or shareholders at the top. Ultimately, I need to serve my constituents, and every rep who enters that building is there because their constituents supported them and voted for them. And so I think that in terms of seeing the change that I want to see, that is a really key part of engaging. When I say, bringing people with me into the State House, that they are able to be engaged in the process. And also make very clear, hard asks of their representatives, because that's what we owe it to them, right? I mean, Rep Provo gets emails, and I already get emails about, where I stand on these amendments and these bills, and as I should be. And so I think that's a really key part that I hope that will change, and that is the part that I really build into, and that's why the rules demands that you saw on Act en Masse's website, came from the advocacy and activist community. This is what we need to see changed. And I think that's a really critical first step to getting towards that.
And Representative, I'll let you sort of wrap us up here. I'm sure you've already done this, but what advice would you give Erica as she comes in January with all her firebrand stuff? What would you tell her to do?
Well, when she says that her idea of working within the system is to work with colleagues to identify common interests, I'd say she's got that part right. That is the heart and soul of it. It's one of the things that's been so difficult since the building closed and we started working remotely. It's hard enough to keep in touch with people that you know and have worked with on Zoom meetings alone. Because as you've probably seen from the gallery, when the House is in session in person, it can seem chaotic. There are people talking to each other and roaming around the room, and it can look incoherent, but it's like a beehive. These are essential communications that are going on. This is our work with our colleagues. Some of our colleagues we don't necessarily see except when we're in formal session, because people are spread out all over the state. We're deprived of that right now, and the incoming class won't have the bullpen. I didn't either, because I came in a special election, and it's something that an experience that I miss. The bonds that are formed when the new class is all stuck in one room with their aides is an essential one. That's the building block of the bigger beehive, in a sense. I'm sure that the representative-elect is on the phone and is reaching out to colleagues in other ways. But I think surmounting that initial obstacle is going to be hard for anyone coming in. And I see it in my colleagues who've been sworn in during the pandemic, who came in special elections. It's tough. They, they need to ask a lot of questions and they want to make connections. But as with every other part of life, right now, it's real hard.
Well, it sounds like you've got your work cut out for you, Erica. But I wanted to thank both of you for joining me today on the podcast. And I also want to thank our listeners for listening, and we'll be back again next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.